I'm here with Amanda Silver, who is the corporate vice president of the dev div, as I think of it, at Microsoft. Is that?
Yeah. I run the product user research and design teams for the developer division, which basically ships all of the products at Microsoft that target developers. So Visual Studio Code, but also our programming languages like TypeScript, C#, .NET. As well as the Azure application platform, so basically where you deploy your applications into.
Right.
But then I have a kind of dual role because I also am the general manager for our own first-party engineering systems. So that means that basically, my team kind of extends the products that we deliver to our customers and kind of adapts them to use inside of Microsoft.
Right. So the internal engineering at Microsoft, which I saw in your post today, over 100,000 people, engineers at Microsoft, are in many ways your first customer, if you will, right, for the developer experience, and obviously provide a lot of feedback there. I'm kind of fascinated by this whole process. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I one of the most incredible things about Microsoft to me over the past 10, 20 years, I guess now, is this transformation into embracing open source and all that. And I know that you play a big role in that.
I'm always kind of careful about using the word embracing open source because I think that's a pretty loaded...
Well, culturally, Microsoft was not a big fan of open source at one point, and that all changed. And I have to say, and I believe you played a big role in this direct feedback from developers, and not just feedback, but letting them work on the product alongside you in public, right?
Yeah, code development. Yeah. I mean, as I was kind of, developing my career, so was Microsoft's transition to think about open source not just as something that is kind of a competitor, but actually as something that's an asset and that can actually accelerate our ability to deliver for our customers, but also a great way to kind of build collaborative partnerships on top of it. So, for me, it first started with TypeScript, and that's actually a perfect example of kind of this first party equals third party ethos that we have inside of Microsoft, which means that, we really try to make sure that what we are suggesting that our customers use, we also use. Mm-hmm. And TypeScript started because basically the Office team was transitioning from, the rich client software that was written in C++ and C#, and they had millions of lines of code, thousands of developers, and all of a sudden they needed to deliver in the context of a browser.
Sure.
And so the question was, how could they do that?
Right.
And
loosely or non-typed language like JavaScript, basically.
And JavaScript at the time basically didn't support, large-scale code bases. They didn't support modularity.
There's probably no objects back then, I would imagine.
There was a runtime notion of objects, but it was mostly a property bag in some senses, and so it didn't really have formal kind of OOP-isms or anything like that. It still doesn't exactly to this day, but bringing the notion of modularity, bringing the notion of static typing, that's kind of how you allow a code base to scale to have not just tens of developers collaborate on it, but thousands.
Right. Yeah, and it helps that you have a guy like Anders.
Yeah,
to do that stuff.
Yeah, Anders at first was skeptical, and then kind of got enamored with the project. But I mean, one of the things that, back to the open source point, for us to be successful with TypeScript, it really required that we build it in such a way that our third-party customers, our external customers, would also use it. And at the time, Microsoft was kind of looked at hostily by
not kind of.
I mean, definitely. I mean, there were people that were pretty.
Well, I think TypeScript was solid enough that was the first chink, if you will, in the armor, and VS Code, obviously, I think was the flood.
I mean, and they also complement each other. VS Code wouldn't exist without TypeScript.
Yeah, nice.
Because both the ability for us to build the fantastic tooling that's in Visual Studio Code was based on the static typing that was in the TypeScript compiler, but also VS Code itself is written in TypeScript. And so, again, to this point about first party equals third party, we are constantly using our own products to build our own products.
I'm old, and I'm not a professional developer, but I have developed software and I do write code from time to time. So, I came up in the world where I actually went to the first, I think it was the first meeting with external people for what became Visual Studio, which was codenamed Boston at the time, 1998-ish, probably.
Right.
And I think it was Developer Studio at first. It became Visual Studio, but that to me that's an IDE. That's the classic way to look at software development. And VS Code to me at first was a little confusing. And it's interesting because now it's several years later and I've really kind of embraced it. And this is a little odd. I actually use it more to write than I do to write code.
Yeah.
Because it's such a great markdown editor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've really come to enjoy its lightness, and I love the serious modularity of it in that you could make Visual Studio Code, whatever you want it to be. It kind of starts as a lightweight client, and you say, well, I need these workloads, right? Not workloads, actually. There's extensions for whatever. And you just optimize it for your own use. You sign in with a GitHub account or whatever. It's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we see a lot of people from a lot of different disciplines using, code, using Markdown, lawyers, for example. Like there's actually surprisingly a lot of folks who are lawyers or kind of other types of publishers who tend to use developer tools sometimes because they have the version control, they have the capabilities that people want. Kind of that precise editing, right? I remember in my college days, we had to do papers for math.
Oh, so you needed
and so my first experience with any kind of Markdown was LaTeX.
Yep.
And just kind of once you get used to that, the idea that you could have kind of a code Markdown transform into something that's a more complex expression, but still a formal language, you kind of become enamored with it.
Plus, plain text, you can't, you can't beat it. And the GitHub integration in Visual Studio Code is amazing. I mean, this is just me. I'm not, like I said, not a professional developer. I find it hard to use in Visual Studio proper. But in Visual Studio Code, it's very natural for me for some reason. It just seems
in GitHub.
GitHub integration, just for.
I mean, I think first of all, Visual Studio Code was kind of designed with GitHub being the hosted source code from the get-go, even before the acquisition, right? Because the JavaScript community largely was an open source community. And so, that's kind of where they all started in terms of what their version control system was. It was GitHub. But also, I think that over time, as, post-acquisition, as we've continued to evolve GitHub to become kind of more of an enterprise solution for, software development lifecycle, I think it's become more apparent that we need better integration in Visual Studio with GitHub. And, for the last couple of years, we've been really working on that. And I think we've made a ton of progress in that sense. The initial kind of implementation in Visual Studio was really based on, old TFS version control.
Yes. That's right.
And so the first thing that we needed to do was to improve the Git experience.
Right.
So we did that for a good year and got it to a really satisfying level. And lately we've been focused on deeper GitHub integration.
Right. I mean, Visual Studio proper is kind of a tough one because there are a lot of expectations. There are a lot of resistance to change, I would imagine. And but it's the way the world has kind of evolved, your world really, right? This year has been very interesting. You see the C# integration and .NET MAUI integration into VS Code. It's almost like big Visual Studio or Visual Studio proper has become not a legacy tool, but a lot of the workloads are almost legacy workloads, if that makes sense. Or people who are maintaining existing code bases.
I don't know that I would describe it that way per se. Sure. I mean, from my perspective, I think that there's kind of two design points from a developer perspective. There's either the design point where you have a lightweight code editor and you assemble the pieces that you have a dependency on. And so that means you need to install the extensions that you need.
Right. That's
or
the dark side of the thing I was so happy
you
about.
have kind of an IDE like experience, the cockpit style experience that I think most C# and Java developers are used to. And it does the full kind of setup of the environment for you on your operating system.
Plus, for larger organizations, obviously, it's that's been one of the things that happened this year in VS Code. Just this sort of integration or addition of the VS project style into VS Code, which
that was the C# Dev Kit extension that we did because we wanted to make sure that we could have the great language support in VS Code as well as Visual Studio. Yeah.
Okay, so we should move into what's happening now because there's a lot happening now.
So we've been busy.
And then this week in particular, there's two things going on, two big things, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, Microsoft Ignite, and I saw your post today, which interesting, it was tied to Ignite, which I thought was very good. And also .NET Conf, right, which is the annual event. So it's too bad in a way they overlapped, or they couldn't be combined in some way. But
I mean, I think of them as spiritually combined.
Yeah, sure.
I think it was always by design that .NET Conf was going to happen, kind of in the lead-in to Ignite.
Right.
I think it's mostly working out. We seem to have, the proper amount of buzz on .NET Conf and could carry the I think the big challenge with Microsoft events a lot is there's so much kind of crossover news, meaning that it not only speaks to developers, but it also really speaks to other disciplines and even mainstream press. As an example. And so sometimes that can make it hard for us to get all of the developer news out because there's just a lot that's coming out from Microsoft at once. And so sometimes, having something like .NET Conf where we can go super deep in the developer content and really make sure that we're hitting our target audience, it's pretty effective.
And it's kind of a fun community thing as well. It mirrors the way those products are developed. You get a lot of interaction with the community, and it's fun.
I think that's the other dimension of it. .NET Conf is definitely kind of a less formal, lighter weight conference where I think a lot of people on the team are having a lot of fun, and a lot of people in the community are having a lot of fun. And it's kind of just like a really fun environment to be a part of.
Yeah, it's neat. I wish almost I could be here. It just,
I know.
I feel like it'd be
we
we
wanted that originally, but we just couldn't get that. Couldn't swing it.
Timing probably.
Yeah.
So there's this little thing happening called AI.
Yeah.
I've been covering this company for almost 30 years, and I have to say, I think actually you might have written this too in your post. I think you did that. People always compare it to the GUI or the internet or whatever, and it's like I think this is bigger. I mean
that's what Jensen said in Satya's keynote, right? That he believes that this is, and that's the CEO of NVIDIA who kind of made a cameo appearance in Satya's keynote. He was saying that he thinks that this is bigger than the internet. It's bigger than the PC possibly, bigger than mobile. And in his words, for sure. For sure.
Okay. Well, it's hard.
So,
I think it is. I really do.
Yeah.
You go through the 7 stages or whatever as you try to, figure out what's happening here. But this year has been a whirlwind of announcements and products now, and I don't think I've ever seen Microsoft move this quickly to embrace something and keep going with it. Right? I mean,
for sure. Yeah. I mean, and I will just say, I think that. A lot of it has really been Satya who has kind of changed the temperature inside of the company in terms of, this is a once in a career kind of opportunity for the company. And I think that he wants to make sure that we're ready to go after it. But certainly every single team has a fire lit up under them. Right. And, we're all trying to do the best we possibly can to make sure that, we're leading the pack in terms of how AI is going to change each of our spaces.
So in the blistering number of announcements that have occurred this year, not just this week, right?
Yeah.
But going back to February, I guess, with the Bing chat, the initial announcement, there's also the part of the world that you deal with, which is the software development end. I mean, how does Microsoft as a company even wrap its head, if you will, around, how are we going to deliver these capabilities, right? Because there has to be so much of it. So, I mean, there are very specific things that were announced this week, both in the .NET side and just generally here at Ignite. But I mean, what are the biggest initiatives, would you say, that will make AI become a part of everyone's app experience or service experience? Like, how do we get from zero to...
Yeah, I mean, for me, part of the reason why I've worked for developers for so long is because everything that is new in technology starts with developers, right? And so it just makes it a very exciting, dynamic space to be in, because whether it's, big data 10 years ago or moving to the cloud or, now in the era of AI, it all has to start with developers first. And so I think one of the things that was incredibly prescient when we think about the copilots, what was the copilot that came out first? It was GitHub Copilot for developers.
Yep.
And, as I think developers start to experience what an AI can do for their workflow, they become inspired.
Yeah.
And they're also working on behalf of their customers.
Right.
So the question then becomes, well, how can I, help my salespeople, my support people, my, automotive engineers, or whichever customer that they are trying to support? I think, bringing it to the developer landscape first is a really great way to kind of inspire everybody to understand how AI can be incorporated into their products.
There's a lot of misunderstanding out in the mainstream press that, AI is the end of developers.
Yeah.
And I look, everyone who's written code has done the thing where you Google or Bing something and you end up on Stack Overflow and you're looking through answers and you're testing code, and this notion of an AI assistant doing that work for you and it without having to leave the editor, I think is incredibly powerful.
I mean, I would say even further. There's one notion of search and kind of bringing search into the context of where you're working. So meeting developers where they are.
Yeah, I mean, whatever the insight was, to put that information in line with where the developer was in GitHub Copilot was the start of this. I think this is the gestation of this idea that context shifting is work interrupted, it's life interrupted. You lose so much time. So by the time you get back, you forget what you were even working on. Not having to context shift, I think, is so important.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's the notion of search and kind of bringing that into the context of the tools that you use to write code, to write articles, whatever it is that you're doing. That's an important thing. I mean, to regain the focus to complete your task takes 23 minutes to get back into that
it's probably longer for me, but yeah.
that dimension of kind of focus, but also when we think about developers and what they need to do, a lot of times they have basically a mental model of the application that they're building in their brains, and that represents cognitive load.
Right.
And there's only so much that each developer can take. And so in a lot of senses, having an AI assistant there that you can query against, that can help orient you and reorient you to understand, how does this complex system work? That's also another dimension that I think is more powerful in some senses than augmenting what internet search would be, because it really becomes this intelligence that has the context of the work that you're trying to complete. And that not only improves the context switching, but it also reduces the cognitive load for you.
Right.
So you can really focus on the work that you're trying to get done.
Yeah, no, right. I go down so many rabbit holes, whether it's writing or writing code, that you just have to almost give up. You reach that point where I can't find the answer to the thing I was looking for. I can't solve this problem, and now I can't even go back and look at the thing I was working on.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing that's very cool about what we see initially in terms of using the AI assistants and copilots across many different contexts, but code as well, is it can also become almost like a coach in some ways, in that you can ask questions about how would I approach this particular problem, and so you might not know exactly what is the approach that you would take, but you can actually describe it into the chat experiences, and it can have context enough to give you not just guidance on what might be the first next step that you should take,
actual direction,
but actually super specific directions in context.
This is exponentially more powerful than something that's already very useful, like IntelliSense or whatever, where you kind of go in and it say, hey, this is a better way to write this block of code, which I always find very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, just to keep you going, I think is so great.
Yeah, I think if it's just a dimension of sustaining your concentration, that in and of itself is incredibly helpful. But it's also super helpful when you think about the fact that junior developers need to often come into a code base and they don't necessarily have their orientation, and they can use this pair programmer to get their orientation. Or the thing that's amazing about being a developer is you're constantly having to master brand new technologies, and so everybody has to bring a beginner's mind to every new technology that they learn constantly. And so having something that can help to orient you, help you come up to speed, and help you complete tasks in that domain quickly, that's really the superpower.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's better than documentation. It's as good as having someone there with you who actually knows the code, I guess.
And even further to that point around documentation, like that's another thing that developers just loathe, is writing documentation.
And this is
and it's just incredible at doing both in-code documentation as well as things like pull request commit messages and things like that. It provides much better insights into what the code change was. Just as an example, in our demo today, we fixed a accessibility issue. You need to have alt text for any image in a website, and the commit message we were going to write. Usually you just write update or fixed alt text issue or something like that.
The same
and what was incredible about what GitHub Copilot suggested in that case is it not only documented exactly what change went in, but it also said why. It said alt text is often, an accessibility issue that helps, folks who use different kinds of ability tools to have things like screen readers. So not only is the developer fixing the code functionally, but they're also getting more educated on the why behind the compliance check.
That's great. Yeah, so it's not just what does this block of code do, but what's the context of why we even did this in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really nice. This kind of gets into your platform engineering discussion, which I found very interesting. So this is basically the engineers at Microsoft who are doing the first customers, if you will, and what you've all learned from their experience as developers and what matters to them. I would imagine that issue we were talking about, you're trying to figure out something and it leads to frustration and it's not a great experience. I mean, but how did this all kind of come about, this notion of platform engineering? What's the
Well, I think platform
that?
engineering is kind of an emerging practice in the industry. It's in some senses, if we think about DevOps and then DevSecOps being the next step beyond that, platform engineering is kind of really becoming the step beyond DevSecOps. And, I think it's a recognition that first of all, the developer experience has really suffered as the number of tools that you need to interface has increased, the complexity of cloud native applications and all of the resources that you need to provision has increased, as well as, the increasing kind of need for security and compliance checks in the code that you're producing. It's just a lot of complexity and a lot of specialized domains that developers need to become expert at. And so the question is, how can we kind of deliver on the security and the quality and the compliance dimensions that modern software requires without requiring every developer to become an expert in security, to become an expert in compliance? And also, compliance checks are kind of one of the things, again, that developers loathe the most.
Yeah, it becomes a frustration.
Because it just feels like it's not the creative dimension of coding.
Yeah, you're not solving the problem you want to solve. You're solving a problem that's just been put in front of you that has nothing to do with
it's table stakes. And oftentimes the code that you need to write is boilerplate code, or it's a compliance check that requires a form filling of some kind, and so it doesn't feel like that brain tickling, puzzle solving dimension of writing code that developers love.
So do you see the improvements in this area already appearing in the UI for products? Is this a thing, I don't know, Dev Home or the .NET Aspire are sort of fall into this category a little bit?
It's a great point. So, I mean, I think there's, if you thought about platform engineering as being kind of looking at the DevOps cycle, the infinity loop that everybody is familiar with, where there's dev on one side and you're doing your dev test and debugging, and then you do continuous deployment, and then you're in the observe and the monitor phases in either production or pre-production environments. Basically, the way I think about it is that AI is a perfect complement to platform engineering, because if we can get to the point where basically AI assists you in creating a fantastic developer experience through each of those different phases of the software development lifecycle, then we hopefully can get to the point where development really becomes a joy again, and that you get to focus on again the creative dimensions of writing code and solving puzzles.
Actually, that's a perfect example. In the productivity space, you sort of think of it in terms of, well, I'm not good at PowerPoint, but I have to do this one PowerPoint presentation this year. So now I have to spend time learning how this tool works instead of just communicating.
Yeah.
And with AI tools, the Copilot stuff that Microsoft is doing right now, those kinds of processes are going to become easier for people who are not experts in that one thing.
Yeah,
and this is the developer version of it, essentially.
Exactly. Great examples, writing and debugging regular expressions, not something that developers love. Writing and debugging YAML pipelines, again, not something that any developer, or maybe there's a few developers in the world, but not many, who love writing YAML. And so, those kinds of things are not the differentiated portions of your application.
Right.
And if you can, use natural language to describe what you need, it can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. Yeah. But also, being able to take extraordinarily complex data. For example, logging information from your production or pre-production environment, to understand the performance characteristics of your application, and then do large data analysis on that to make recommendations to improve your performance optimizations or to improve your resource consumption. Those are the kinds of things that we are able to do now that literally are so advanced in terms of developer sophistication that it oftentimes takes folks 5-6 years into their career before they feel like they are proficient at hunting for performance optimizations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you worded it this way, but it's almost like platform engineering requires AI in a way to be truly efficient or
I think to deliver the fantastic developer experience, the notion of platform engineering is something that's super helpful, because it can help you do automation. It can help you, respond to compliance issues. And it basically is just a codification of best practices inside of your organization. But to do it in a way that delivers a fantastic developer experience and doesn't just feel like a wall of issues that comes from, a static analyzer, that feels very natural in your flow, that you can query against and deeply understand. I do think that the best complement is an AI peer programmer.
Yeah. No, it's incredible what's happening right now. I mean, I do think some people don't understand the depth of this and how big it is, and I didn't too, to be fair. I mean, I went through those stages, like I said, earlier this year, but
I do think that one of the things that I think is prescient about our approach here was that we brought Copilot to developers first.
Right.
And so developers could see it in their context.
And then understand that using this in their own the products they're building.
Exactly, right? If they understand how helpful it can be for them to complete their job, if they're working on behalf of salespeople or support engineers or automotive engineers, they can kind of get inspired by what they see in the context of the developer space that we're providing, and then build their own intelligent applications for their end users.
Yeah. So actually, speaking of intelligent applications, what is? I mean, there's probably a short term and then a long term view of what this means. I suspect a lot of developers are going to want to add AI functionality to existing applications, and that's one thing, right?
Yep.
Sort of a co-pilot type existence, I guess. And then longer term, there will be these new applications that came out of this era that are were built with AI from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what is the process of building intelligent applications look like today, and how do you think it's going to change?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say we're still learning on a lot of this. And that's one of the dimensions you were touching on earlier, kind of how does Microsoft respond to this as quickly as we do? Part of it is, we really have this growth mindset and try to kind of share our learnings across the entire company as we do it. But basically what we see is this notion of having AI-based functionality requires that you are able to evaluate how effective that AI-based functionality is in helping your user.
Right.
And so the question then becomes, how good are you at evaluating how effective your application is today?
Right.
And so getting to the point where you have feedback systems, fast feedback systems, is an absolutely essential dimension of building AI-based functionality, because you need to understand if the suggestion that the model made was actually valuable to your customer. And then the question then becomes, how do you collect that feedback, both in terms of the qualitative feedback as well as the quantitative dimensions of that, and then continually improve the user experience so that it becomes more and more effective, more powerful, and more useful to your end user.
Right. So I can't let you go.
Okay.
Until we talk a little bit about Windows, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One of the nice pushes to me this year has been this emphasis on Windows as the platform for developers. The latest version of Windows 11 has developer tools built in by default, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
There's been a bunch of announcements this past year, DevBox, obviously, and then DevHome, which is built into Windows WSL, which predates 11. I think it predates 11. And then we have Windows AI Studio, which is not a Windows tool exactly, but a Visual Studio code experience, right? That for developing AI solutions that run locally, right? Using local hardware, right? Which could be Windows or another platform or whatever. But this renewed kind of emphasis on Windows to me is very exciting. But how do you view it? Obviously, Visual Studio Code is cross-platform, right? So that runs anywhere. But this renewed emphasis on Windows, is this did this come out of DevDiv, or was this a...
Oh, it's definitely a cross-company collaboration. I think first of all, a majority of the developers in the world are Windows users.
Right.
And so there's huge demand, and it might not always be apparent in Silicon Valley, but if you look across the entire world, a vast majority of developers use Windows.
Right.
And so, that in combination with the idea that, in a lot of senses, the act of provisioning a developer workstation could move into the cloud.
Right.
And I think part of what we're seeing happening is that, while cloud-based solutions in terms of the production environment might be running in Linux kind of as the default, that's the runtime, application runtime.
Right.
The end user that is doing the development still wants a user-friendly operating system to be able to complete their work. And for a lot of people, that's Windows.
Yeah.
And so I think the combination of kind of like, Linux as the target for the production environment, bringing WSL into this context, and then kind of improving the developer box configuration and setup, is super complementary to the approach that we're taking with Microsoft DevBox to virtualize developer workstations. And so what we're trying to do is to kind of figure out how we can optimize the DevBox setup experience both across Visual Studio and Windows itself to, just get you there faster. Like DevBox setup is something that's very painful for a lot of developers, and
Sure.
and if we can make that easier, that's super helpful.
What's the typical customer for DevBox? Is it larger enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting about DevBox setup is, when you think about like a information worker kind of role, setting up your machine is something that you do maybe every 5 years when you get a hardware upgrade, or, maybe every time you switch jobs, you have to do it. But it's not something that you do super frequently.
Right.
But for developers,
you kind of lose that. Yeah.
We will do it multiple times a month. We will do it sometimes multiple times a week because we need to investigate a new bug. Or if you're going to learn a new technology, you need a clean developer workstation to kind of have the right SDKs and environment variables installed to be able to compile the thing that you need to write. And so it helps every individual developer, but it's extraordinarily helpful to organizations and teams because it means that you can amortize that DevBox setup time across your entire team.
Yes.
I have folks who had geographically distributed teams. Some folks were local, and other folks were across the world in an entirely different time zone.
Right.
Trying to explain to a developer across the globe how to get a developer box that matches mine so that we can work on the same, repo and have the same build environment is extraordinarily difficult and extremely error prone. Oftentimes, folks would do it. They think they followed the instructions all the same, but then you end up on an hour-long debugging session trying to find that one environment variable that you didn't set up right, and now your build won't work.
This is the dream. The smallest version. This is Visual Studio Code. You sign in with your GitHub account or your whatever your Microsoft account, and you get all your extensions and things, and that's nice. And there's a thing happening in DevHome that I think is very interesting, kind of a winget based configuration, so you can do a PC configuration with all the apps you need, and I think it's YAML, based scripting for for bigger companies that want to do that, get into that, which is horrific, but it's there, and I think that's going to get better. But yeah, the DevBox is kind of the ultimate. It's just a push button reset, and you've got that whole thing back exactly where you want it.
Yeah, and so that means that you can amortize the cost of DevBox setup across your entire team, but it also means that you don't have to compromise on the personalization of your developer experience if you have, certain settings that you like for the theming of your code editor, or you like your Windows terminal set up in a particular way. Sure. You can still apply all of your customized personalization settings while still having a kind of base image that your organization uses.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I want this to come down in a way to for smaller organizations or whatever, but it's such a great capability.
Yeah, I don't think there's any limit in terms of the size of your organization. Yeah. So I think you could use it, Paul.
Okay, I'm rolling my own at this point, but we'll get there someday. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about? There's a lot of stuff this week. We only hit on kind of the top edge of it.
There's just so much. I do think that it's definitely worthwhile to talk about, the news at .NET Conf.
Yeah.
Especially in that, .NET 8 is now GA, fastest release of .NET ever. Right. Optimized for cloud native developer experiences.
Which is actually it kind of ties into something you were saying earlier. This notion of having to go through the boilerplate of figuring out what this kind of in this case a cloud app is. What does this mean? And I know Microsoft earlier this year had kind of tried to formalize this notion of a cloud agnostic cloud app and the things you would need to make that happen. And I feel like .NET Aspire might be almost like an implementation of it for the .NET space, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact is when you have a cloud native application and you have you're using microservices, there's a lot of kind of like questions around how do you get those different services to communicate with one another, and how do you do deployment across multiple binaries, right? In the old days, it was like you would build your binary, you would literally copy and paste it into a folder onto your app server,
right?
And those days are gone. And now you have to provision resources, you have to get the right application modules and microservices on the right machines that are then calling to the right web APIs to be able to kind of orchestrate the way that your application comes together. And this practice, again, coming back to the notion of platform engineering, one of the dimensions of platform engineering is oftentimes having a set of architects decide what are the components that you're going to be using for building applications. And the fact is that, in the past, .NET was really just a programming language runtime. Then you would have ASP.NET for an application runtime, but ASP.NET was really at the single application level. It wasn't at the multi-service orchestration level.
Right.
And so in some senses, you can almost think about Aspire as an opinionated stack in the same way that your architects might come up with for multi-service cloud-native application architectures.
Right. It's an interesting expansion of .NET. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the .NET of today, .NET as we know it now, is such a different beast than it was in the beginning. And I know you played a role in that transition, but this to me is in many ways the best part of Microsoft, if you will. I mean, Microsoft at its best, maybe is the way to say it. And I love the open development model. I love the community engagement part, and that they're able to contribute to the code. It's such a different, transparent and truly open system, which I just think is incredible.
Yeah, and actually it was awesome. We announced .NET Aspire yesterday at .NET Conf, and we already have multiple PRs coming into .NET Aspire to enable new functionality that we didn't originally ship.
Also, it just happens on such a predictable schedule. It's sort of it's quite interesting, and also it often translates into an under promise over deliver situation. Dave Ortno and Maddie were talking about this with .NET MAUI, this notion of we always knew we were going to land here at this time, but we were able to get more stuff into it because of that community engagement. It just happened, and so we didn't have to wait for the next version. It happens continuously now. It's really nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hallmarks of being a good partner in any sense is that you're predictable and that you hit the timeframes that you talked about,
right?
But also that you're open to collaborating. And I think that the .NET ecosystem and .NET itself really hits all of those marks right now.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
So good to talk to you.
Yeah, fun to be here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.